We are back tracking the Atlantic hurricane season, which, by all intents and purposes, is seeming to be ramping up at this point. And it's taken a while, so we could see a lot of storms very quickly, kind of an explosion of sorts. So we're going to go through the GFS and the European model, both of which have similar outcomes, but kind of different ways of going at it. And there's a few major differences between the two, which are very important, especially one that I'm going to talk about first here. So here's Tropical Tidbits, starting off with the GFS model. The GFS has a system here, first off, forming out of Africa, kind of have a few here, but the main one that we're going to be talking about here is this one in the Caribbean that moves into the Gulf of Mexico, potentially becomes a major hurricane, and makes landfall just south of the Texas-Mexico border. But at the same time, you have a tropical system north of Puerto Rico, one just off the coast of Africa, just northwest of the Cape Verde Islands, and eventually these start to make their way to the north, both of which being mostly fish storms. Now this one furthest to the west could be a problem for Bermuda, and that eventually may become a major hurricane here. But then you have even more. You have another one just off the coast of Florida that starts to move up the east coast of the United States. You have another one here potentially in the Gulf of Mexico again. So the GFS has, I believe this is 5 storms in the matter of the next week and a half. So that's definitely an explosion to me. But the European model takes a little bit more of a, let's call it a realistic approach. Although the European model has absolutely nothing in the Caribbean and the Gulf, which is good news for this region of the country. Definitely don't need a hurricane to make landfall on top of all the other flooding issues and drought issues that have been plaguing that region of the country for the past month and a half. But it does have a couple of tropical systems here off the coast. This is now the 1st of September, and you can see that these start to move to the west. The one furthest to the west has the most energy to work with, so it consumes the most and becomes the strongest, potentially a major hurricane there. And these two systems here really don't do much. But this is potentially in line for a landfall here in portions of Florida, or maybe it enters the Gulf of Mexico based on this high pressure right here, which will steer this storm potentially probably into the Gulf of Mexico there. And then you have another high pressure system here, which controls these two, potentially bringing this system here. It starts to bring it a little bit further to the north. So let's take a look at kind of the underlying conditions that are allowing these two models to be so different. And with the Atlantic, we're usually seeing some volatility, but this is unprecedented levels of volatility. Now, the GFS is showing plenty of water on the main development region, in the Caribbean, in the Gulf of Mexico, and at some points here, especially when those major hurricanes are happening, it's 3 or 4, I believe these are in millimeters or centimeters of extra water in the atmosphere. So definitely a lot more moisture to work with. That's definitely one factor here. Whereas the European model, why is this on? There we go. Actually, let's just do this. And the GFS has actually less active wind shear, especially in the main development region in a few days, but right now in the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. But eventually the main development region does start to become more conducive in terms of wind shear, which again will allow more storms to blow up quickly. If there's wind shear, the storms will have to overcome a lot of adversity to actually form and become tropical storms or hurricanes. But with limited wind shear, there's definitely a higher possibility of storms forming and maintaining their strength and even growing in strength, potentially even rapid intensification. Now, the European model is definitely reduced on both of those fronts, having just above average water to dispose of, mostly just off the African coastline, which makes a lot of sense in the tropical regions of Africa, But in terms of the east coast of the U.S., the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, these areas are just above the average here. And surrounding these tropical systems, you can see that there is below average, which means that these storms are consuming all the moisture possible here. So definitely a more reasonable outcome here. That's why the European model is usually more accurate. It just has a lot more realism to it. The GFS can spiral out of control pretty quickly if you give it enough ripe conditions for tropical development. The other big thing here, the European model does have this area of lower than average wind shear in the Caribbean, just no storm that forms there. And then eventually it also shows the main development regions starting to get a little bit lower in terms of the wind shear, especially this area of like 30 knots above average wind shear, starting to kind of dissipate and move off to the north, allowing the main development region, especially just north of the areas that we can look at, like Senegal, just this pocket here of lower wind shear does allow these storms to get a little bit more strength before they start to get ripped apart in the areas with higher wind shear. So when it comes down to it, I'm kind of taking a blend of these two models. When it comes down to it, I think the conditions are ripe for a storm in the Caribbean. It does seem like, based on both of these, you have plenty of moisture in the region at the moment on both of these models. In fact, you have plenty of moisture in the Gulf of Mexico. You also have lower than average wind shear in the region, which also does help in these matters. So I think there definitely is a possibility here of a tropical system in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, do I think it's going to be very strong? No. I think that the European model is going to be kind of, as the realist here, we're going to be seeing just above average amounts of water in the atmosphere, just above average moisture. And in terms of wind shear, it's going to be average to barely below average wind shear. So definitely not as ripe of conditions as areas such as the main development region, which will see 5 to 10 knots below average wind shear. So that is definitely more conducive. And I believe the European model here that we are going to see at least one possible hurricane or major hurricane coming out of the main development region. It just seems like all the conditions are there. There's plenty of moisture. There's plenty of wind shear favorability there, less wind shear. So it does seem like we're kind of at that time now for storms to start spawning up here in the Atlantic. So if I were looking anywhere, I would look at the Western Caribbean and into the Western Gulf of Mexico for a potential tropical storm, low-end hurricane, and eventually into the main development region and just north of the Windward Islands for a potential hurricane, maybe even a major hurricane if the wind shear does allow for a storm to rapidly intensify. But at this point, that would still make this a bit of a slow hurricane season, so definitely still more to come. But on average, the peak of hurricane season is about September 10th. So we definitely are moving towards that point where if the Atlantic doesn't get active now, it does seem like we'll be on pace for a below normal hurricane season. But it does seem like things are conducive for development. It's just a matter of the right place at the right time for a tropical system to form, and whether that system is allowed to flourish or is knocked down right away. So we'll have to see how things go here, but it does seem like we are looking up in the Atlantic. But that is all the information that I have for today. If you found this video informative and useful, consider leaving a like, subscribing, and hitting the bell. But that is all the information that I have for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.